The frogmen arrive. Edward T. Higgins had seen combat before, but nothing like the maelstrom that surrounded Okinawa, an island perched roughly 400 miles southwest of Kyushu, the southern tip of Japan's home islands. Higgins belonged to a relatively new, little-known outfit the Navy called Frogmen, the Underwater Demolition Team's UDTs. Their mission was brutally simple. Slip in before the main landings, locate and clear whatever obstructions the Japanese had seeded along the beaches, and make sure the assault waves could hit the sand on schedule, April 1, 1945. What Higgins and his teammates found confirmed every nightmare scenario. A lethal hedge of underwater mines was lashed to lines of telephone poles, the gaps between them webbed with barbed wire. It was a minefield with teeth, designed to rip open landing craft and drown men before they ever saw land. Working partly submerged and partly on the surface, Higgins fought to keep his mind on the job as the entire horizon erupted. Behind him, the fire support plan for the invasion pounded Okinawa, imprecise, layered violence. Later, he tried to describe the sound, a drumroll of thunder overhead, as small landing craft gunboats, LCIGS, raked the shoreline with 20 and 40 mm quads and .50 caliber fire that hissed just feet above the swimmers' heads. Beyond them, destroyers carved grid patterns with 3 and 5-inch shells, stitching the jungle in tidy, mathematical rows. Farther out still, cruisers and battleships fired in great, synchronized salvos, 6-, 8-, and 16-inch guns whose blasts made the ground jump and shudder, sending columns of dust and debris boiling into the sky. That orchestration at sea foreshadowed the brutality to come ashore. Okinawa would become a 3-month slugging match, with Marines and Army infantry wrestling over ridgelines and cave complexes in some of the Pacific War's fiercest close quarters fighting. But for men like Higgins, another war, quieter until it wasn't, was unfolding on the water. It would soon make even hardened grunts pity the sailors who had to face Japan's newest, most unnerving weapon, the kamikaze. To take Okinawa, the United States had gathered a floating continent, more than 1,200 ships, 18 battleships, roughly 200 destroyers, over 40 carriers, escorting and delivering the assault troops. The Armada sprawled across the Pacific's map, assembling from the Marianas, the Philippines, the Solomons, Hawaii, and the American West Coast. Under Vice Admiral Raymond A. Spruance, victor of Midway, and Vice Admiral Richmond Kelly Turner, the amphibious maestro, the fleet's scale rivaled what had stormed Normandy less than a year earlier. Strategically, Okinawa was the next stepping stone in a two-pronged advance that had been muscling west and north since 1942, through the Solomons, the Gilberts and Marshalls, the Marianas, New Guinea, the Philippines, and Iwo Jima. Take Okinawa, and American bombers could leap straight into the Japanese heartland. The island would also serve as a staging area for a potential invasion of Kyushu or Honshu. The Americans saw it as a necessary bridgehead. Imperial Japan saw it as a last gate before the homeland. Tokyo understood the blow was coming, but by early 1945 it lacked almost everything: ships, oil, munitions, even trained pilots. American air raids were grinding down what industry remained. So Japan reached for the one resource it still had in abundance: men willing to die. One plane for one ship, an equation as stark as it was desperate. The tactic had debuted at Leyte Gulf in October 1944 under Vice Admiral Takao Onishi, later remembered as the father of the kamikaze. The very name, kamikaze divine wind, reached back to a 13th century typhoon that had smashed a Mongol invasion and, in Japan's telling, saved the nation. To American sailors, the idea of a pilot deliberately flying his aircraft into a ship felt alien and terrifying. They knew sacrifice. They had seen men throw themselves on grenades to save their squad or charge positions against impossible odds. But kamikaze attacks were something different, not a spur-of-the-moment act by one man, but an organized method, scaled and systematic. As historian Samuel Eliot Morison would write, few weapons spread such flaming terror, such searing, indiscriminate death, as a man turned into a missile. As Higgins and his fellow UDT swimmers worked through the surf, the shape of the coming fight, at sea, was already set. Japan's Plan Tengo, Heavenly Operation, envisioned waves of massed air assaults, the Kikusui or floating chrysanthemums, launched from Kyushu and Formosa. Old trainers, seaplanes, scouts, and worn-out fighters would all be hurled into the storm, alongside rocket-boosted, man-piloted bombs called Oka, cherry blossoms, that would ride to battle under a bomber's belly, then scream toward a ship at near-uninterceptable speed. On land, Japanese commanders meant to make the Americans pay ridge by ridge, forcing the fleet to linger offshore to pour in shells and supplies. turning the sea into a hunting ground. For the sailors, it would be an ordeal of constant readiness, gunnery by day, star shells by night, and the gnawing knowledge that somewhere beyond the radar horizon a pilot was already coming, intent on dying if he could take a ship with him. For now, though, the job was the beach. Higgins and his team kept cutting and marking, working in the strobe light of muzzle flashes, the sea slapping against their masks. Behind them, the Armada's thunder rolled on, the vast machine turning. 2 days later, on April 1st, 1945, Easter Sunday and April Fool's Day, America would go ashore, and the waters around Okinawa would become the most dangerous place on Earth. The Armada and the objective, why Okinawa mattered. By late March 1945, the Pacific looked less like an ocean and more like a logistics diagram. Task forces stitched wake lines from Pearl Harbor and the West Coast, from Ulithi and Eniwetok, from Leyte, Saipan, and the Solomons, hundreds of ships converging on a single, rocky rectangle, Okinawa. In that rectangle lay airfields, anchorages, and above all, geography. Barely 400 miles from Kyushu, it was close enough for bombers to hit the home islands in waves and for transports to stage the men and material required for an invasion of Japan itself. The numbers were gargantuan. More than 1,200 hulls rode the swells, 18 battleships, about 200 destroyers, over 40 aircraft carriers, plus cruisers, frigates, LSTs, LCTs, LSMs, hospital ships, ammunition ships, the alphabet soup of amphibious war. It was a floating city with its own hospitals, bakeries, machine shops, and fuel farms, all run to a timetable measured in minutes and miles. Vice Admiral Raymond A. Spruance commanded the whole, as methodical as a slide rule. Vice Admiral Richmond Kelly Turner orchestrated the amphibious ballet, and across the horizon, Marine and Army divisions waited in their transports, rehearsed to the point of exhaustion. Okinawa's strategic logic was brutally clear. The twin American drives, the Central Pacific push through the Gilberts, Marshalls, and Marianas, and the Southwest Pacific advance through New Guinea and the Philippines, had pantsed toward Japan for 3 years. Each hop captured airfields that brought the next target into range. With Iwo Jima taken, fighter escorts could shepherd between lines. With Okinawa seized, heavy bombers, fighters, and patrol aircraft could operate practically on Japan's doorstep. The island would also become a staging ground, depots, repair facilities, and acres of anchorage where the invasion armadas for Kyushu or Honshu could form up under friendly air cover. For Japan, that made Okinawa a red line. Lose it, and the Americans would have a springboard for the kill. Keep it, bleed the enemy enough at sea and ashore, and perhaps the Allies would reconsider the cost of invasion. That calculus shaped both sides' plans. The U.S. would bring overwhelming steel, air power, and logistics. Japan, short of everything but determination, would trade lives for time and tonnage. The invasion plan reflected lessons learned since Guadalcanal. Fire support was layered and relentless. Pre-landing bombardment was charted to the yard line. Underwater obstacles would be hunted by UDT swimmers. Assault waves were timed to the tide. Reserves were positioned to exploit success or plug disaster. Carriers would fly combat air patrol and close air support in overlapping cycles. Destroyers, the fleet's knife fighters, would screen, shell, rescue, and if necessary, die. Yet even as officers briefed the scheme down to the minute, they knew Okinawa was different. It sat outside the easy umbrella of American land-based air, but within reach of Japanese fields on Kyushu and Formosa. Camouflage, dispersal, and the sheer number of enemy strips meant the Navy could not simply bomb the threat out of existence. The fleet would have to linger close day after day, night after night, pouring ordnance ashore and supplies onto beaches, exactly the condition Japanese planners wanted. So the Americans built an early warning net. 16 radar picket stations were plotted like beads on an arc around the island. At each sat one or more destroyers, sometimes with support craft, scanning the sky and calling in raids while fighter direction teams vectored interceptors. Everyone understood the arithmetic. The pickets would be the first to see the enemy and the first to be hit. On paper, the plan balanced movement and protection. In practice, the sea would turn predatory. The kamikaze was engineered to short-circuit the Navy's strengths. Speed past the flak, accept the hit as success, convert a cheap aircraft and an irreplaceable pilot into a hole torn in a ship's vitals. The fleet's answer would be disciplined gunnery and sheer endurance. But before any of that, there was the beach. The Armada's purpose, after all, wasn't to fight ships. It was to land soldiers and Marines who would fight men dug into limestone and clay. Okinawa's ridgelines ran like vertebrae down its length, honeycombed with caves and reverse-slope defenses. If the ground campaign bogged down, the fleet would remain exposed, and the exposure would invite waves of suicide planes. Thus the objective, stated coldly on planning maps, felt visceral to the men aboard: take the island fast enough to shorten the fleet's time in hell. If Okinawa fell quickly, the sailors might steam away intact, the airfields would sprout American roundels, and the next chapter, whatever form it took, would be written from a position of strength. If it dragged on, the ocean itself would become a killing ground. With the plan set, and the beaches marked, the calendar turned. April 1st, 1945 loomed, Easter Sunday, April Fool's Day, and D-Day for the last great amphibious operation of the Pacific War. Engines thrummed. Briefings ended. Men checked gear, and in quiet corners their luck. The fleet tightened its ring. The next part of the story would be told by Fire. Japan's dilemma and the birth of the kamikaze. By early 1945, Japan's war machine was collapsing in on itself. Its navy, once the terror of the Pacific, had been shattered at Leyte Gulf. Its merchant fleet was crippled by submarines. Fuel was scarce, steel was scarcer. Bombers from the Mariana Islands struck Tokyo at will. Factories that had once poured out Zero fighters and destroyers now produced little more than rubble under the steady rain of incendiaries. Yet for the men in Tokyo's Imperial General Headquarters, surrender was unthinkable. The loss of Okinawa would mean more than a tactical setback. It would be the symbolic breach of Japan's sacred threshold. For centuries, no foreign army had ever invaded the home islands. To lose Okinawa, barely 400 miles away, would mean inviting the enemy to Japan's very doorstep. Honor, ideology, and fear fused into one desperate logic. If they could not stop the Americans by strength, they would stop them by sacrifice. The calculus of desperation. Imperial planners understood the arithmetic too well. They had perhaps a few hundred ships still afloat, many of them obsolete. Their oil reserves were measured in weeks. Ammunition and bombs were rationed, even rifle cartridges were counted. But they had one resource the Allies could not bomb out of existence: men still willing to die for: the Emperor. From this realization was born the grim equation: one aircraft, one ship. If every pilot could destroy just one enemy vessel, perhaps Japan could reverse its downward spiral. It was a weapon strategy drawn not from technology, but from psychology, using human resolve to fill the gap left by material scarcity. The father of the kamikaze. The man who gave this concept form was Vice Admiral Takejiro Onishi, commander of the 1st Naval Air Fleet. A stoic strategist and career officer, Onishi had watched the U.S. Navy's relentless advance across the Pacific and understood that conventional air tactics could no longer halt it. In October 1944, during the Battle of Leyte Gulf, he authorized the first Takotai special attack units, whose pilots would deliberately crash their aircraft into Allied ships. Onishi named them kamikaze, the divine wind. The term reached back to the 13th century, when a legendary typhoon had destroyed Kublai Khan's Mongol fleet and saved Japan from invasion. Now Onishi hoped to summon that wind again, not from nature but from the human spirit. At first, the tactic seemed horrifying even to Japanese officers. But desperation has its own momentum. The first kamikaze pilots struck on October 25, 1944, during the battle off Samar. One of them smashed into the escort carrier USS St. Lo, detonating the ship's bomb magazines and sending her to the bottom. The spectacle stunned both sides. Within weeks, the Tako Corps became official policy. The divine wind becomes a storm. By the time Okinawa loomed, the kamikaze had evolved from a desperate improvisation into an organized doctrine. Thousands of young pilots, many barely trained, volunteered for the missions. Some were driven by nationalism, others by social pressure, and some by an almost mystical belief that dying for the emperor would cleanse their souls and redeem their nation. They wrote farewell letters, posed for photographs with white headbands bearing the rising sun, and toasted one another with cups of sake before climbing into their planes. Mechanics painted rising suns or cherry blossoms on the fuselages. The rituals were solemn, rehearsed, and chillingly calm. Not all of Japan's leaders were comfortable with it. Admiral Onishi himself wept when assigning his pilots to die. "These are my sons," he said. "They are dying for Japan because we have failed them." Yet he pressed forward, convinced there was no other path left. The American reaction. To American sailors, the first sight of a kamikaze was pure disbelief. Men had seen suicide in war, soldiers throwing themselves on grenades, tankers refusing to abandon burning Shermans, but never weaponized self-destruction on this scale. Here, death was not a risk, it was the tactic itself. For the men aboard destroyers and carriers, it meant that traditional defense, flak bursts, evasive maneuvers, armor belts, no longer guaranteed survival. As historian Samuel Eliot Morison later wrote, few weapons have ever spread such flaming terror, such torturing burns, such searing death, as did the kamikaze in his self-destroying onslaughts. The enemy no longer feared dying. He sought it, the weapon of last resort. The plan that would shape Okinawa was Operation Tengo, Heavenly Operation, a series of mass suicide raids called Kikusui, floating chrysanthemums. The Japanese air staff envisioned collecting over 4,000 aircraft for successive attacks on the U.S. fleet, with waves of 50, 100, even 300 planes at a time. Each raid would pair escort fighters with kamikaze planes, some carrying bombs, others packed with explosives and fuel. Among these were the new Oka, cherry blossom, rocket-propelled bombs, a human-guided missile. A bomber would carry the Oka beneath its fuselage to within range, release it, and the pilot inside would ignite his rocket engine, streaking toward the nearest ship at almost 600 miles per hour. Against such speed, no gunfire could react in time. In Tokyo's logic, it was simple: destroy enough American ships to stall the invasion. Buy time, force negotiation, perhaps even avert total destruction. But at sea, where Edward Higgins and tens of thousands of others waited, that plan meant something far simpler: a sky filled with men who wanted to die, and a fleet that had to survive them. Operation Tengo and the floating chrysanthemums. By the spring of 1945, Japan's desperation had hardened into grim invention. The grand strategy that once sought to dominate the Pacific was gone. What remained was a war of attrition by sacrifice. Operation Tengo, literally Heavenly Operation, was the embodiment of that idea. An all-out coordinated assault meant to bleed the American fleet off Okinawa dry through relentless suicide attacks from the air and sea. The plan from Tokyo, the blueprint for Tengo, was simple and ruthless. Japan would gather every available aircraft, fighter, bomber, seaplane, or trainer, fit for flight. They would be thrown, wave after wave, against the Allied ships clustered around Okinawa. Most of these planes would never return. They were never meant to. Tokyo's planners envisioned as many as 4,500 aircraft for the operation. They would attack in massive coordinated raids called Kikusui, or floating chrysanthemums, a poetic name that masked their savage intent. The chrysanthemum, imperial flower of Japan, symbolized purity and renewal. To the pilots who wore the emblem on their headbands, death in its service was not annihilation but transcendence. In practice, each Kikusui was a suicide armada. Half of the aircraft were conventional fighters meant to escort the kamikazes, distract American interceptors, and dive on gun positions once the chaos began. The other half were the special attack planes, packed with explosives and fuel, guided by men who had already written their last letters home. The 5th Air Fleet. Vice Admiral Mato Mogaki, commander of Japan's 5th Air Fleet, was given operational control. His orders were to unleash successive waves as long as planes and pilots could be found. Tokyo stripped every available airbase in Kyushu and Formosa to feed his squadrons. Ogaki's aircrews were a strange mixture of the new and the broken. Teenagers who had barely soloed, veteran instructors too proud to let their students die alone, mechanics pressed into service after a few hours of flight training. Shortages of fuel and equipment forced improvisation. Old floatplanes and biplanes were converted into kamikazes. Even gliders were tested for one-way missions. The irony was brutal. The pilots were plentiful, but the planes themselves were often death traps before they ever met the enemy. Many never reached their targets, falling into the sea from mechanical failure or running out of fuel. Still, Ogaki's staff drove them forward. The pilots' devotion became a weapon more dependable than their machines. The Oka, cherry blossoms of death. Among Tengo's deadliest innovations was the Yokosuka MXY, 7 Oka, literally cherry blossom. It was a manned rocket bomb, 22 feet long, carrying a warhead of more than a ton of explosives. A lumbering twin-engine bomber, usually a Mitsubishi Betty, would ferry the Oka under its belly to within 50 miles of the target, then release it. The kamikaze pilot inside ignited 3 rocket motors, and in seconds the weapon accelerated past 500 miles per hour. The Oka could not be intercepted once it was launched. It moved too fast, its profile too small. Its weakness was the Betty itself, slow, underarmed, and easy prey for American fighters. Many were shot down before they ever released their deadly cargo. But when an Oka found its mark, the results were devastating. A fleet doomed to sail. Tengo did not rely solely on the air. Japan's remaining surface ships were also summoned for a final, suicidal gesture. At the heart of this plan was the battleship Yamato, pride of the Imperial Navy, and the largest warship ever built. In a separate but related operation, sometimes called Tengo Tokubetsu, the Yamato, 1 cruiser, and 8 destroyers were ordered to steam south from Japan on what was effectively a death voyage, reach Okinawa, beach themselves, and fire their guns until destroyed. It was an act of ritual defiance more than strategy. The Yamato carried only enough fuel for a one-way trip. The ship's officers understood this. They saluted their crew with sake before departure, knowing few would see Japan again. American submarines and aircraft spotted the force almost immediately, and carrier planes from Task Force 58 pounced. By sunset on April 7th, Yamato was gone, capsized by multiple bomb and torpedo hits, taking more than 3,000 men with her. The sinking of Yamato did nothing to slow the kamikaze waves. If anything, it signaled that Japan had fully embraced death as strategy. The sea itself would now carry their vengeance. The floating chrysanthemum blooms. Between early April and late June 1945, 10 major Kikusui operations were launched. Each varied in size and ferocity, but together they represented the largest sustained suicide campaign in military history. The first, Kikusui No. 1, began on April 6th. 700 aircraft took to the air, half kamikazes, half escorts, and hurled themselves at the Allied fleet. They came in from every direction, hugging the sea, diving out of the sun, or appearing at dusk when the light confused radar screens. For the Americans, it was a new kind of storm. Gunnery crews fired until their barrels glowed. Ships that survived the first wave faced a second. Destroyers darted between carriers to pull survivors from flaming water, even as more planes screamed in. The defenders quickly learned the psychology of the attack. The kamikaze would keep coming even while burning, wings sheared off, or engines shot through. They had to be destroyed utterly, pilot, plane, and bomb, before impact. The human cost. Within days, the waters around Okinawa became littered with oil slicks and wreckage. Smoke columns rose from ships struck amidships, others limped away trailing flames. And yet, for every kamikaze that found its mark, many more fell short, shot down by interceptors or cut apart by anti-aircraft fire. The Americans began to grasp the strange paradox of their opponent's strategy. The kamikaze was tactically effective. It could sink ships that conventional bombing could not, but strategically suicidal. Every attack drained Japan's finite supply of pilots and aircraft faster than the Allies could lose them. Still, statistics were cold comfort to the men standing watch on picket destroyers. For them, every radar blip meant a man determined to die trying to kill them. And as April 1945 deepened, Kikusui No. 1 was only the beginning. Defending the island, ridges, caves, and strategy that trapped the fleet. While Japanese pilots prepared to turn the skies above Okinawa into a killing field, another army waited below the island's hills, silent, unseen, and far more disciplined than the Americans expected. The Imperial Japanese Army had learned from every defeat in the Pacific, and by 1945 it had perfected the art of defense in depth. Okinawa would not be another Iwo Jima or Peleliu, where defenders fought to the last man on the beaches. This time, the beaches would be bait. The new doctrine, bleed the invader. The man shaping this strategy was Lieutenant General Mitsuru Ushijima, commander of the Japanese 32nd Army. A calm, thoughtful officer, Ushijima understood that Japan could not repel the invasion outright. His objective was not victory in the conventional sense, but delay, to make Okinawa such a costly battle that the United States would reconsider invading Japan's home islands. Every day his men held out, every American ship kept offshore, was a day closer to forcing negotiations or buying time for Japan's final defense. Ushijima and his chief of staff, the fiery General Isamu Cho, constructed a plan that transformed Okinawa itself into a fortress. Instead of meeting the enemy at the water's edge, they would withdraw inland to prepared positions, forcing the Americans to fight uphill through ridges and ravines that had been pre-sighted for artillery and machine gun fire. A fortress beneath the earth. The Japanese engineers on Okinawa turned the island's natural features into a labyrinth of death. The coral and limestone were soft enough to dig, yet strong enough to withstand bombardment. By the time the Americans arrived, Ushijima's men had carved hundreds of miles of tunnels connecting caves, bunkers, and pillboxes, some large enough to house artillery batteries, hospitals, and command posts. Gun ports were carefully camouflaged. Mortars and machine guns were recessed into hillsides and could fire without revealing their positions. Caves had interlocking fields of fire so that any attacker advancing into one valley could be struck from several angles. The Japanese even created false cave openings to lure American grenadiers into ambushes. Every approach route, every ridge line, was mapped to slow the invaders to a crawl. When the Americans finally landed on April 1st, they found the beaches nearly undefended and assumed the worst was over. It had only just begun. The silent beaches. The assault waves came ashore at Hagushi Bay with almost eerie ease. The first day's losses were negligible. Marines and Army troops joked that the Japs had quit. They were wrong. Ushijima had ordered his men to hold their fire until the Americans penetrated deep inland, where artillery hidden in the Shuri Line, the island's central defensive belt, could strike with devastating precision. For a week, U.S. units advanced unopposed, spreading across the island and seizing airfields. Then, suddenly, the ridges ahead exploded. From an invisible front, Japanese mortars, howitzers, and machine guns unleashed a torrent that pinned entire divisions in place. The Americans realized too late that they were caught in a trap. To take Okinawa, the Navy had to stay close to shore, and the longer the battle lasted, the more time the kamikazes had to attack the fleet. The Shuri Line. At the heart of Ushijima's defense lay the Shuri Line, a chain of heavily fortified ridges and hills running east to west across southern Okinawa. Names like Kakazu Ridge, Sugarloaf Hill, and the Maeda Escarpment would soon enter the grim lexicon of Marine Corps history. Every position was layered, infantry in caves, artillery behind, and mortar teams above, linked by tunnels that allowed troops to retreat, regroup, and re-emerge elsewhere. The Americans threw everything they had at these positions: naval bombardments that turned hills into craters, air strikes that dropped napalm and 1,000-pound bombs, and infantry assaults that clawed forward yard by yard. But the Japanese simply vanished underground, weeding out the barrages before returning to their firing positions. Each ridge became a miniature Iwo Jima, gained only after days of fighting and hundreds of casualties. The human cost of strategy. To Ushijima's mind, the suffering of his soldiers served a larger purpose. As he told his officers, "Each day we hold Okinawa, each ship we sink, each American we kill, buys time for Japan." He exhorted his men to match the courage of their brothers in the air, the kamikazes whose spirits still soared above them. In reality, the strategy was as cruel to his own troops as it was effective against the enemy. Japanese soldiers fought without hope of survival. They were told to die in place rather than surrender. Food and water grew scarce in the tunnels. Medical care was primitive. Thousands of wounded men chose suicide with grenades rather than capture. Still, the plan worked. It trapped the Americans in a slow, grinding campaign that forced the Navy to remain within striking distance for weeks on end. The chain reaction at sea. Each day of delay ashore meant another day of agony at sea. To support the ground troops, U.S. battleships and cruisers pounded enemy positions daily. Destroyers stood in close to provide call fire on request, and carriers flew almost constant air support. The fleet became a floating artillery battery and an irresistible target. The Japanese commanders knew it. Every day that American forces remained bogged down in the ridges of Okinawa was another opportunity for Vice Admiral Agaki's Fifth Air Fleet to strike with kamikazes. The land and sea battles became inseparable, each feeding the other's destruction. The balance shifts. By mid-April, the pattern was set. The soldiers bled on the ridges, and the sailors burned at sea. Okinawa had become a perfect trap, a convergence of strategies that punished both sides with mechanical precision. Ushijima's men fought from the shadows, the Navy fought from the horizon, and between them the sky filled with the rising smoke of ships and the drifting ash of men. The Americans would soon learn that the enemy's cunning extended beyond the caves. Just miles west of Okinawa, on a cluster of small islands, another hidden threat was waiting to be discovered, one that promised to make the coming weeks even deadlier. Karamaretto, the hidden suicide boat base. Before the main invasion of Okinawa could begin, the U.S. Navy needed a safe anchorage, a place close enough to stage repairs, refuel ships, and treat the wounded, but far enough from enemy artillery to avoid constant bombardment. The chosen site was Karamaretto, a small cluster of rocky islets about 18 miles west of Okinawa's main island. It looked quiet, almost insignificant on the map. But in late March 1945, Caramaretto revealed a deadly secret that would send a chill through every American sailor waiting offshore. Securing the gateway. On March 26, 1945, 6 days before the main landings on Okinawa, elements of the U.S. 77th Infantry Division came ashore on the largest of the Kerama Islands. The operation was meant to be quick. Mop up any scattered defenders, establish a repair and supply base, and move on. At first, that's exactly how it went. The Japanese garrisons were small and offered scattered resistance. Within hours, Marines and soldiers controlled the beaches, and Navy construction units began surveying potential anchorages. Then came the discovery, the caves that breathe death. While patrolling the cliffs and rocky coves, American troops stumbled upon what looked like boat shelters cut into the rock. Inside the caves, they found hundreds of small wooden craft, roughly 18 feet long, narrow, and crudely built. Many had twin depth charges lashed to the stern. Others were fitted with explosive warheads in the bow. Counting them all, U.S. intelligence officers realized they had uncovered a base for more than 350 suicide boats. The Japanese called them Shinyo, Sea Quake, or Maru-ni, depending on the service branch that used them. They were fast, up to 30 knots, and meant to be piloted by a single man, often barely out of his teens. Each boat carried two 250-pound charges, or a single large explosive, in its nose. The pilot's mission was simple: steer at top speed into an Allied ship or landing craft and detonate upon impact. It was a naval kamikaze force, hidden in plain sight. A plan that never launched. The suicide boats had been stationed in Caramaretto for months, camouflaged inside sea caves and concealed under nets. The plan was for them to remain hidden until the American fleet anchored near Okinawa, then to surge out at night in coordinated waves. Hundreds of boats, attacking in darkness and at close range, could have turned the invasion anchorage into chaos, fuel ships burning, transports exploding, destroyers sinking before they ever fired a gun. Fortunately for the Americans, the 77th Division arrived first. The Japanese defenders fought fiercely to the last man, and a few suicide boats managed to slip out and attack. But the assault was disorganized and quickly crushed by destroyer gunfire. Most of the boats were destroyed in their caves by grenades or flamethrowers before they ever left the shore. The discovery left a sobering impression. The suicide boat base at Caramaretto was a glimpse of what awaited them closer to Japan, a nation willing to turn every weapon, every machine, every human into a guided bomb. The cost of securing the anchorage. Even though the operation succeeded, Caramaretto was not without loss. Small skirmishes flared in the hills, and the Japanese garrisons fought with a fatalistic ferocity. Once the islands were secured, U.S. forces found dozens of civilian bodies, men, women, and children who had taken their own lives rather than face capture. It was an ominous foreshadowing of what the Americans would later see on Okinawa proper. By the end of the operation, Caramaretto became one of the most important logistical hubs of the campaign. It hosted repair ships, floating dry docks, hospital vessels, and ammunition tenders. Damaged destroyers limped there after kamikaze hits. Their burned and wounded crews were treated in makeshift infirmaries before returning to duty. The little island chain became, in one sailor's words, a graveyard and a workshop in the same breath. The lesson of Caramaretto. For Admiral Spruance and his staff, the discovery of the suicide boat base changed everything. It proved that Japan had adapted its defensive mindset to the sea as thoroughly as to the land and air. Anything that floated or flew could now become a weapon. The Karama episode also underscored the grim pattern that was beginning to define the Battle of Okinawa. Every Japanese plan, no matter how improvised, was designed to delay. Each day the invasion dragged on, the fleet remained within striking distance of kamikazes. And the longer the fleet stayed, the higher the body count climbed. An ominous calm. After the conquest of Caramaretto, sailors could look across the horizon and see Okinawa's ridges faintly outlined against the haze. The sea seemed almost peaceful, the calm before the storm. Yet everyone sensed what was coming. One officer aboard a destroyer wrote in his diary that night, "We've cut off the head of one snake, but the nest still lies ahead. If they had launched those boats, we'd have lost half the fleet before the landings even began." He was right about one thing: the real storm was still waiting. In less than a week, on April 1st, 1945, the largest amphibious assault of the Pacific War would begin. And offshore, the Navy's radar pickets, thin lines of steel guarding the fleet, would soon face the full horror of Japan's Kikusui onslaughts. The radar picket line, early warning at deadly cost. When the U.S. fleet took position off Okinawa in late March 1945, it resembled a vast, living organism, each ship a vital cell in a complex body that stretched from the beaches to the horizon. But every organism needs a nervous system, a way to sense danger before it strikes. For the fleet, that early warning network was made of destroyers, small, agile ships with powerful radar, stationed in lonely arcs far from the main force. They were called the radar pickets, and for 3 months, they would endure the most dangerous duty in the Pacific War. The shield around Okinawa. Vice Admiral Richmond Kelly Turner, responsible for the amphibious operations, understood that radar was the fleet's lifeline. The Japanese bases on Kyushu were barely 400 miles away, and kamikaze aircraft could cover that distance in under 2 hours. Without warning, hundreds of planes might descend on the anchored invasion fleet. To prevent that, Turner ordered destroyers to form a ring of picket stations, 16 in all, spaced like beads on a chain around Okinawa. Some were set as far as 75 miles from the main anchorage, others closer in, guarding the key approaches. Their mission was simple: detect incoming enemy planes early, radio a warning to the carriers, and guide defending fighters to intercept them. In practice, it meant facing the storm alone. Each picket station usually held 1 or 2 destroyers, sometimes with a support vessel such as a landing craft, minesweeper, or smaller escort. They were too far apart for mutual protection and too lightly armed to withstand mass attack. They were the tripwire. If the kamikazes came, the destroyers would see them first, and often die first. A duty of isolation. Life on a radar picket ship was a study in tension. The crews were isolated for days at a time, surrounded by an ocean that looked serene but could erupt at any moment. The radar screens glowed in the darkened combat information centers, each blip a possible death sentence. Sailors slept in their clothes, guns manned around the clock. They learned to read the sky and the static on their headsets like fortune tellers reading omens. When the radar operators called out bogies inbound, the decks erupted into motion. Men sprinting to battle stations, ammunition chains clattering, gunners training their barrels skyward. A single destroyer's radar might detect dozens of planes, but in many cases, the warning came only minutes before the attack. The unequal battle. The destroyers were brave but outmatched. Their 5-inch guns and 40mm quads could shred 1 or 2 planes at a time, but the kamikazes did not come 1 or 2 at a time. They came in waves of dozens, attacking from all angles and altitudes. The Japanese had studied the radar patterns and learned to exploit them. Pilots often approached low over the water, where the waves confused radar returns, or came in behind friendly aircraft to slip through the defensive screen. Some kamikazes deliberately followed American fighters back to their ships, then dove out of the sun in the final seconds. Even when the destroyers managed to sound the alarm, there was often little they could do for themselves. The bigger ships, carriers, cruisers, and battleships, were protected by overlapping zones of anti-aircraft fire and combat air patrol, CAP, fighters. The pickets were too far out for either. They were bait, and they knew it. Courage under fire. Still, the destroyers fought like cornered wolves. Sailors became expert marksmen, cutting down attackers at frighteningly close range. They learned to fire continuously, even through smoke and flames, until the kamikaze either exploded or missed by inches. Captain Frederick Moosbrugger, commanding one of the picket groups, summarized the mission's grim math. Every minute we stayed alive was another minute for the fleet to prepare. Every plane that came for us was one less going for the carriers. That calculus was small comfort to the men standing on deck, watching the horizon. They knew the enemy would come again. It was never a question of if, only when. The strain of waiting. For many sailors, the waiting was worse than the combat itself. Radar warnings would sound at all hours, sometimes false alarms, sometimes real, but every alert sent hearts pounding. Men lived on coffee, cigarettes, and adrenaline. The sea air reeked of cordite and sweat. One destroyer sailor wrote in his diary, "You wait, you scan the sky, and you pray you'll see them before they see you. Then you see a glint, and the fear turns into fire. You stop thinking. You just shoot." Some ships endured multiple attacks in a single day. Others went down before their first report was finished. Crews rescued survivors from burning wrecks, only to take their places at the same cursed stations the next morning. The picket line's sacrifice. By the end of the Okinawa campaign, the radar picket line had become the most lethal assignment in the U.S. Navy. Out of 101 destroyers that served on picket duty, nearly half were damaged or sunk. Hundreds of sailors were killed, thousands wounded. Yet their sacrifice saved countless lives aboard the larger ships closer to shore. The pickets gave the fleet precious minutes to launch fighters, man guns, and brace for impact. Without them, the kamikazes would have struck the carriers and transports directly, and the cost might have been catastrophic. The calm before Kikusui, number 1. By the end of March, all 16 radar picket stations were in place. The men aboard them could see the smoke from the pre-invasion bombardment and the glow of Okinawa's burning villages on the horizon. The invasion was only days away. In Tokyo, Vice Admiral Agaki's 5th Air Fleet was already assembling its first Kikusui wave, hundreds of kamikazes preparing to take off from Kyushu and Formosa. Their orders were simple: find the fleet off Okinawa and die in the act of destroying it. The picket destroyers would meet them first. And on April 6, 1945, when Kikusui No. 1 roared out of the sky, 3 destroyers, Bush, Colquhoun, and Cassagnan, would stand directly in its path. Kikusui No. 1, April 6 to 7, 1945, Bush, Colquhoun, and Cassagnan. At dawn on April 6, 1945, the sky above Kyushu filled with the growl of engines. Japan's first Kikusui, the floating chrysanthemum, had taken flight. Around 700 aircraft, roughly half of them kamikazes, rose from airfields across southern Japan. Their destination, the vast U.S. fleet off Okinawa. Their mission, to die. Below, the sea was deceptively calm. Off Okinawa's northeastern approach, 3 American destroyers, USS Bush DD-529, USS Colquhoun DD-801, and USS Cassagnan DD-793, stood watch at radar picket stations numbered 1, 2, and 3. They were the eyes of the fleet, scanning the sky for the first sign of the storm. Within hours, those 3 names would become symbols of courage and of the terrible price of vigilance. The storm breaks. At 2 p.m., radar screens aboard the Bush began to glow with approaching contacts. Dozens of blips appeared, enemy aircraft diving from altitudes ranging between 500 and 20,000 feet. The destroyer's crews sprang to battle stations. Guns loaded, crews braced. The first kamikazes were coming in. The Bush's 5-inch and 40mm guns barked to life. In seconds, the sky was a web of black flak bursts. The gunners shot down 2 attackers and drove off 2 more. Then, from a haze, a 5th plane dropped low and struck. The kamikaze smashed directly into the Bush's forward engine room. The explosion tore through the hull, killing most of the men stationed there and flooding compartments. Flames erupted. The destroyer slowed, then stopped. Dead in the water, the Bush began to list. The Colquhoun answers the call. The Bush's radio operator sent short, clipped transmission. AM hit. Need assistance. Miles away, the USS Colquhoun received the call. Commander G.L. Parker ordered his ship toward the stricken destroyer. By 4:35 p.m., the Colquhoun was nearing station number 1. But the Japanese were waiting. A dozen kamikazes suddenly dove from the clouds, zeroing in on the Colquhoun. The first hit squarely on the main deck, detonating near 2 40mm gun mounts and killing their entire crews. A second followed within minutes, plowing into the forward fire room and blasting a massive hole below the waterline. The ship shuddered but fought on, firing at every approaching aircraft. Smoke and fire poured from her decks as more kamikazes came in. 2 slammed into the Colquhoun superstructure, one tearing away the bridge and another exploding near the aft gun positions. The destroyer was finished. A dual catastrophe. Now both the Bush and the Colquhoun floated helplessly, ablaze and listing, perfect targets for more incoming attackers. Kamikazes swarmed like hornets, diving through walls of tracer fire. At 6 p.m., another plane struck the Bush, hitting with such force that her hull nearly broke in 2. The surviving crewmen scrambled overboard, diving into burning oil slicks. 30 minutes later, a swell rolled her onto her side, and the Bush slipped beneath the waves. Nearby, the Colquhoun was still burning. Commander Parker ordered the crew to abandon ship. Some men dove into the water, others clung to debris as explosions rippled across the deck. When the last survivors were clear, the destroyer Cassagnan, which had raced to assist, was ordered to sink the Colquhoun with gunfire, ending her agony. By nightfall, both destroyers were gone. Cassagnan's ordeal. The USS Young had arrived too late to save her sister ships, but not too late to feel their fate closing in. As she picked up survivors from the sea, her radar showed new waves of planes approaching. The sky, as one sailor later described it, seemed full of wings. The Young's gunners fired until the barrels smoked. They splashed several attackers, but could not save everyone. Many of the men they pulled from the water died of burns or exhaustion before night fell. By dusk, 129 men were dead, 53 wounded, and 2 destroyers, Bush and Colquhoun, lay on the seabed northeast of Okinawa. The toll on the fleet. The attack on April 6th to 7th was just the beginning. Across the fleet, the kamikazes struck with unprecedented fury. In a single day of Kikusui No. 1, 6 ships were sunk, 3 destroyers, 1 landing ship tank, LST, and 2 ammunition ships. 10 more were badly damaged. 367 American sailors died in the first 24 hours of Japan's new offensive. And yet, even amid the devastation, the U.S. Navy fought back with staggering efficiency. Anti-aircraft gunners and carrier-based fighters destroyed more than 350 enemy aircraft in the same period. But it wasn't enough. 33 kamikazes had still made it through to their targets. The beginning of a pattern. Admiral Raymond A. Spruance, commanding the Fifth Fleet, took the reports that evening aboard his flagship Indianapolis. The numbers chilled him. He knew that what had happened to the Bush and Colquhoun was not an anomaly, it was the new face of naval warfare. There would be more Kikusui waves, more kamikazes, more dead ships. His fleet was tied to the invasion and could not withdraw. Every day the soldiers fought on Okinawa's ridges meant another day his ships had to remain within range of the suicide planes. As Spruance studied the damage reports, his flagship shuddered slightly beneath his feet. A kamikaze had struck the Indianapolis herself earlier that day, a glancing hit, but a warning all the same. The admiral didn't need reminding that no one was safe, not even the commander of the fleet, the men in the water. For the survivors of the Bush and Colquhoun, the night was long and terrible. Oil and gasoline burned on the waves, lighting the sea with a flickering orange glow. Wounded sailors clung to life rafts, some singing to stay awake, others praying quietly. Sharks circled in the distance. The Young and nearby ships worked through the darkness, pulling men from the sea. Many who were rescued were too badly burned to speak. One petty officer later recalled, "They didn't cry. They didn't shout. They just looked at you, eyes wide open, like they were still seeing the planes coming down." The radar picket line had done its job. The fleet had been warned in time, and the invasion beaches remained untouched. But the cost was measured in fire and blood. The lesson of Kikusui No. 1. When the reports reached Washington, the statistics seemed clinical. Ships lost, planes destroyed, tonnage damaged. But to the sailors off Okinawa, Kikusui No. 1 was not a battle, it was a revelation. The Japanese had found a weapon that required no victory to succeed. Each kamikaze that died forced the Navy to spend shells, fuel, and hours of terror. The strategy didn't need to destroy the fleet, it only needed to keep it suffering. And the suffering had only begun. 3 days later, on April 11th, a new Kikusui wave would come. This time, it would bring a weapon even deadlier than the suicide plane, the rocket-powered Oka, the cherry blossom of death. Kikusui No. 2, April 11th to 12th, 1945, the Oka strikes, and the loss of USS Maynard L. Able. 3 days after the destruction of Bush and Colquhoun, the sea off Okinawa seemed deceptively quiet. But for every lull in the battle, there was a gathering storm. The Japanese Fifth Air Fleet was already preparing its second massive kamikaze wave, Kikusui No. 2, scheduled to strike on April 11th to 12th, 1945. The Americans knew it was coming. A captured Japanese pilot had boasted under interrogation that a greater wind would soon blow across the island. Fleet intelligence confirmed the threat. Admiral Spruance and Vice Admiral Turner issued urgent orders, cancel non-essential operations, tighten anti-aircraft patrols, and prepare for another all-out assault. But nothing could truly prepare the men for what came next, a weapon faster than any they had ever faced. The calm before the fire. By mid-April, the skies over Okinawa had become a deadly carousel of raids and counter-raids. American carrier planes hunted Japanese airfields on Kyushu and Formosa daily, but with little permanent effect. Japan had so many hidden airstrips and camouflage dispersal zones that new planes seemed to sprout from the ground each dawn. Offshore, the Navy maintained its ring of picket ships, the fragile radar net that guarded the invasion fleet. One of those pickets, the USS Laffey DD-724, took station at radar picket position number 14, about 75 miles northwest of Okinawa. Her crew knew the assignment's reputation: isolation, exhaustion, and near-certain attack. Still, morale was high. The Able had already weathered several air raids, and her crew had grown confident in their gunnery. No one on board yet knew they were about to make history, as the first American ship ever sunk by a new, terrifying weapon, the Oka, cherry blossom of death. The Oka, meaning cherry blossom, was Japan's final, desperate evolution of the kamikaze concept. Officially the Yokosuka MXY-7, it was less an airplane than a manned missile, a small rocket-powered craft with a 2,600-pound warhead in its nose and a cockpit just big enough for a single pilot. Carried beneath a twin-engine Betty bomber, the Oka was released about 20 to 30 miles from its target. The pilot would ignite 3 rocket engines and steer his flying bomb at over 500 miles per hour, too fast for conventional anti-aircraft guns to track. The Americans nicknamed it the Baka, Japanese for fool. But when the first one hit, no one was laughing. The attack on Able. At 1:38 p.m., April 12th, radar aboard the Laffey Able detected enemy aircraft approaching. 12 Japanese planes appeared, diving out of the north. The destroyer's guns opened up immediately. The first wave came in low, traditional kamikazes. The Able's 5-inch batteries scored 2 hits, and the first attacker exploded in midair. Another smashed into the sea, trailing fire. Then from high above the melee, radar picked up a strange, fast-moving object dropping toward the ship at incredible speed. Within seconds, the Oka was upon them. The rocket-powered craft struck the Able amidships, just below the bridge. The impact detonated deep inside the hull, touching off stored ammunition. Witnesses later described it as if the ship had swallowed lightning. A blinding flash split the destroyer in two. In less than 5 minutes, the Laffey Able was gone. Both halves of the ship slipped beneath the waves, leaving hundreds of men struggling in oil-covered water. Out of a crew of 345, 84 were killed instantly or drowned. The aftermath: horror on the water. Survivors later recalled the eerie silence that followed. The sea was littered with burning debris, life jackets, and bodies. Men clung to pieces of wood as other Japanese planes continued to strafe the wreckage. One sailor wrote afterward, "There wasn't even time to be scared. Just a flash, and then the ocean swallowed everything. I remember the sound of metal twisting, like it was alive, and then the smell of burning oil. It never left me." Nearby ships rushed to help, destroyers Haley and Sproston among them, while still fending off new attacks. They rescued as many men as they could, pulling oil-soaked survivors from the sea under strafing fire. By the time the last man was hauled aboard, the Laffey Able had vanished completely, leaving nothing but an expanding oil slick and a few shattered lifeboats. The worst threat yet. Naval historian Samuel Eliot Morrison, observing the Okinawa campaign, later wrote, "The small size and tremendous speed of the Oka made it the worst threat to our ships that had yet appeared, almost equivalent to the guided missiles the Germans were firing at London." For American sailors, the weapon changed everything. The Oka could not be shot down once launched. The only defense was to intercept and destroy its Betty bomber carrier before it released its deadly cargo. Carrier pilots began patrolling farther north, targeting launch bases and bombers on the ground whenever possible. Even so, dozens of Oka sorties would be attempted in the weeks to come. Most failed. The slow Bettys were easy prey, but the few that broke through left scars the Navy would never forget. Kikusui No. 2 expands. The Oka attack was only one chapter of Kikusui No. 2. Across April 11th and 12th, roughly 400 Japanese aircraft, half escort, half kamikaze, hurled themselves at the American fleet. The attacks came in waves, some at midday, others near dusk, forcing the defenders to fight for nearly 36 straight hours. This time, the kamikazes managed to hit several of the Navy's largest ships. The aircraft carriers USS Enterprise and USS Essex both sustained damage. The battleship USS Tennessee took a direct hit to her superstructure, killing and wounding dozens. When the smoke cleared, one American ship lay at the bottom. 18 more were damaged, and more than 60 sailors were dead. Yet another 350 Japanese planes had been destroyed, a staggering loss, even for a nation already bleeding dry. The psychological toll. For the sailors manning the picket line, the second Kikusui brought something new, a deeper fear. The Oka's speed and power seemed almost supernatural, a weapon impossible to stop. Men spoke of it in hushed tones, as if naming it might summon another. A destroyer gunner later confessed. You could see it for a second, just a silver blur, and then there was nothing left to shoot at. It was like death itself flying straight at you. The Navy began reinforcing picket stations with additional firepower and deploying small fighter-director ships to improve reaction time. But everyone knew the truth. If an Oka got close enough, nothing could save them. A deadly routine. After April 12th, the attacks eased briefly. Crews caught a few hours of rest, patched holes, and buried the dead at sea. But no one relaxed. They all understood the pattern now. A few days of quiet, then another storm. The radar picket destroyers, now nicknamed the Tin Can Sailors, stood their posts once again, guns manned, radar humming, eyes fixed on the empty sky. They knew the third Kikusui was coming. They just didn't know when. And when it came, the kamikazes would not come alone. They would come in swarms, attacking ships faster than they could be counted. Among their targets would be the destroyer USS Pringle, whose fate would be remembered as one of the most desperate fights in naval history. Pringle and Laffey. Minutes in Hell, Voices of Survival. By mid-April 1945, the pattern of battle around Okinawa had become brutally familiar. Every few days, another Kikusui, another floating chrysanthemum of kamikazes, rose from Kyushu and came screaming down on the fleet. The sailors called them raids, but the word felt too small for what they endured. Each attack was less a military operation than a storm made of fire, steel, and human will. The third major assault, Kikusui No. 3, arrived on April 16th, and with it came two of the most harrowing ordeals in naval history: the sinking of the destroyer USS Pringle, DD-724, and the near destruction of USS Laffey DD-724. The radar picket station of death. That morning, the Pringle was on duty at picket station number 26, roughly 75 miles northwest of Okinawa. She wasn't alone. Another destroyer, the USS Hobson, patrolled nearby. The sky was bright and clear, the kind of weather that made sailors uneasy. It meant the Japanese could see them perfectly. Around 1 p.m., radar picked up multiple bogies inbound. The ships braced for impact. Within minutes, the first Zeros appeared, diving out of the sun. Sonarman First Class Jack Gebhardt was on deck when the attack began. He remembered the first planes coming in low, engines roaring. The Japanese came in waves and sent everything at us. All attacks were kamikazes, and every type of aircraft was used, some barely able to fly. What a waste of human life as we shot them down. The air raids were endless. Our nerves were frayed and our stomachs churned at the thought of being killed in a horrible blast or gasoline fire. The Pringle's gunners opened up, scoring hits on several planes. Black bursts of flak dotted the sky. Then one Zero came through. The hit. At 1:58 p.m., a kamikaze dove straight toward the ship's forward stack. It passed just feet over Gebhardt's head before smashing into the superstructure near the bridge. The impact detonated two 500-pound bombs carried on the plane. Gebhardt recalled the instant of impact. When the bombs exploded, it seemed like the world ended. The chart house rumbled and years of dust crashed down from the overheads. The ship was on fire, men were screaming, and I knew she was going down. The blast severed vital power cables and opened a gaping wound in the destroyer's hull. Fire and smoke engulfed the deck. The Pringle began to list sharply to port. Gebhardt tried to escape. I managed to bend the door from the top and slide out onto the open bridge. The ship was a burning hulk with men stumbling dazed and bleeding from a flying debris. Just then someone yelled, "Abandon ship." He removed his shoes and hat, laid them neatly against the bulkhead as if I was coming back, he wrote later, and dove overboard into the sea. A ship in flames. Within minutes, the Pringle broke apart. Her bow and stern lifted high out of the water as the midsection crumpled. Men leapt into the ocean as ammunition cooked off in fiery bursts. The destroyer slipped under completely in less than 5 minutes. Gebhardt floated on his back, watching helplessly as his ship disappeared. The bow and stern were pointed sharply upward, and I heard screams as she slipped under. The Japanese planes circled overhead like angry hornets to make sure Pringle was dead. The nearby Hobson fought off the attackers, laying down a blanket of anti-aircraft fire to protect the survivors. She even fired short bursts into the water to scare away sharks. When the attack finally ended, landing craft moved in to rescue the living. Gebhardt had been in the water for 7 hours before being pulled aboard. The first thing handed to him was a bottle of whiskey. He later wrote, "My hand shook as I drank and thought of my shipmates, sharks, fire, and terror of the last few hours. The sight of Pringle going under was still vivid in my mind." Out of Pringle's crew of 310, 258 survived, but the memory of that 5-minute destruction would haunt them for life. The ship that would not die. While Pringle was perishing in the Northern Ark, another destroyer, USS Laffey DD-724, was fighting her own private war a few miles east at the same cursed station where Bush and Colquhoun had gone down 10 days earlier. The Laffey was already a veteran. She had stormed the beaches of Normandy less than a year before, earning a reputation for toughness. On April 16, 1945, she would prove it beyond doubt. That morning, radar detected a massive formation, nearly 50 enemy aircraft, heading directly for her. Commander Frederick Becton, the ship's captain, ordered battle stations. The first Zeros appeared minutes later. The destroyer's gunners opened fire with every weapon they had, 5-inch, 40mm, and 20mm guns, even small arms. For a time, the air seemed to shimmer with tracers. They shot down 9 planes in the first 10 minutes. But the rest kept coming. One kamikaze every 4 minutes. For 90 minutes, the Laffey fought an inferno. Kamikazes attacked in waves from all directions, some diving vertically, others skimming the waves. One plane slammed into the aft deckhouse, igniting aviation fuel. Another crashed near the bridge, killing most of the gun crew. Bombs jammed the rudder and knocked out electrical power. With steering gone, the ship began to circle helplessly, a perfect target. A third kamikaze struck the mast, showering the deck with shrapnel. Fires raged everywhere, ammunition cooked off, and the sky turned orange with smoke. Still the crew fought on. A sailor whose legs had been torn off by a bomb explosion continued to fire his 20mm gun until the last attacking plane disappeared. "Please, please get me out of here," he whispered before dying at a station. Commander Becton refused to abandon his ship. Over the roar of flames and explosions, he shouted to his men, "I'll never abandon ship as long as a gun will fire." His defiance rallied the crew. Despite 8 kamikaze hits and 4 direct bomb strikes, Laffey somehow remained afloat. The miracle of survival. After nearly 2 hours of continuous attack, help finally arrived. Other destroyers and tugboats converged, pouring water onto the flames. The Laffey's decks were charred, her hull torn open, her guns twisted like scrap metal, but she refused to sink. One sailor later wrote, "The ship looked like a ghost, black and burning, but she was alive. You could almost feel her breathing." When a Navy tug finally took her in tow, Commander Becton, exhausted and soot-covered, collapsed beside his men. His ship had been hit by 22 separate attacks and was still floating. From that day on, the Laffey would carry a new name, the ship that would not die. The human edge of endurance. The twin stories of Pringle and Laffey capture the essence of the Okinawa campaign, courage balanced on the edge of madness. The sailors were running on. Adrenaline and fear, their nerves frayed by weeks of unending assault. Some joke darkly that the Navy should issue Purple Hearts for insomnia. Captain Charles R. Brown, a staff officer, tried to describe the emotion that haunted every survivor. "I doubt if there is anyone who can depict with clarity our mixed emotions as we watched a man determined to die in order that he might destroy us in process. It was a strange mixture of respect and pity, respect for anyone who offers the supreme sacrifice for what he believes, and pity for the utter frustration epitomized by such suicidal acts." The pattern of suffering. By the end of April, the picket line was bleeding steadily. Each station told the same story. Warning given, planes detected, ship hit, or sunk. The Navy called it early warning. The sailors called it suicide duty. But there was no alternative. Without the destroyers absorbing the first blows, the kamikazes would have reached the carriers and transports unopposed, and the entire invasion might have failed. Okinawa was no longer just a battle for an island. It had become a test of endurance between two nations' definitions of courage. One willing to die to defend its homeland, and one willing to endure death after death to finish the fight. And as May approached, the struggle was about to reach its breaking point, at sea, on land, and in the minds of the men who fought it, the grind and the strain, fire support, fracture command, and the Bunker Hill inferno. By May 1945, the Battle of Okinawa had become a monstrous machine that consumed men, ships, and sanity in equal measure. The rhythm of life at sea was unrelenting. days of ceaseless gunnery, nights of eerie tension under tracer-lit skies. Sailors called it the meat grinder, a campaign that devoured everything from destroyers on the picket line to the morale of men who hadn't slept properly in weeks. The fleet that couldn't leave. For Admiral Raymond A. Spruance, commander of the Fifth Fleet, the problem was as strategic as it was human. His ships could not withdraw. The Marines and soldiers ashore were locked in a slow, grinding advance against the Japanese defensive maze on the Shuri Line, and every yard gained depended on the Navy's constant fire support. Each morning, battleships and cruisers pounded enemy ridges with high-explosive shells, shaking the earth beneath the infantry. Each night, destroyers fired star shells to illuminate no man's land and break up Japanese counterattacks. Major General Pedro A. Del Valle, commanding the 1st Marine Division, sent a message of gratitude to the battleship Colorado. Your superb shooting has been a constant inspiration to our troops. Every Jap captured reveals the awe and fear with which all Japs regard your gunfire. The Marines meant it, but the gunners aboard Colorado and dozens of other ships were paying a steep price. Firing by day, standing night watches, and living in constant expectation of another kamikaze raid, they were reaching the edge of exhaustion. Sleep, sweat, and smoke. To many sailors, the sea around Okinawa felt like purgatory. The air stank of cordite and salt. The decks were always hot, sun by day, flames by night. Every man slept in his life jacket, half expecting to wake in the water. A destroyer sailor named Fred Poppy later described the waiting. We get warnings about half an hour before they appeared. The waiting was worse than the fighting. You knew they were out there, you knew they were coming, and their one wish in the world was to kill you. Others turned to gallows humor. A crew of one picket destroyer painted a huge arrow on their stern pointing backward with the words, "Carriers this way." It was a joke, but also a plea. Fractures in command. As the weeks dragged on, tension began to show not only among the sailors, but also among their commanders. Spruance and Turner grew increasingly frustrated with the slow progress ashore. To Spruance, the Army's cautious, methodical advance meant one thing: the fleet had to stay within range of kamikaze attack for far longer than planned. Each day of delay meant more destroyers sunk, more lives lost. In a letter to a fellow officer, he vented his anger. I doubt if the Army's slow, methodical method of fighting really saves any lives in the long run. It merely spreads the casualties over a longer period and greatly increases the naval casualties when Jap air attacks on ships are a continuing factor. Vice Admiral Richmond Kelly Turner, commanding the amphibious forces, went further. He urged the Army to attempt an amphibious landing behind the Japanese lines to break the stalemate. The Army commanders refused, unwilling to risk the logistics of another seaborne assault. The Navy seethed. Their ships were dying by inches, tethered to the battle's slow grind on land. The toll at Caramaretto. At Caramaretto, now a repair and medical hub for the fleet, the true cost of the campaign was visible for all to see. Sonar man Jack Gebhardt, survivor of the Pringle, called it a graveyard of shot-up tin cans. Some had their stacks shot off, some were beached to avoid sinking, others burned black with bomb holes. You could see the damage and wonder how anyone lived through it. Beach destroyers pumped seawater out of their hulls to stay afloat, repair ships patched steel with wood, hospital ships overflowed with burned victims. The anchorage that had once been a symbol of security had become a floating morgue. The battle of bureaucracy. Even 6,000 miles away in Washington, D.C., the fight was spilling into the halls of power. Admiral Ernest J. King, Chief of Naval Operations, clashed with Army Air Force's leadership over the use of B-29 bombers. The Navy wanted the giant bombers diverted from their raids on Tokyo to hit the kamikaze bases in Kyushu. The Army Air Forces balked. Its generals saw Okinawa as a naval problem. King hinted that if the Army refused, the Navy might stop supplying its island air bases in the Marianas. Under that threat, the B-29s reluctantly joined the fight over Kyushu. Even so, the raids did little to halt the kamikaze tide. Spruance sent a grim message to Admiral Chester W. Nimitz. The skill and effectiveness of the enemy's suicide air attacks and the rate of loss and damage to ships are such that all available means should be employed to prevent further attacks. Nimitz soon arrived in person to prod the ground commanders. When one Army general snapped that the Navy didn't understand land warfare, Nimitz shot back. Yes, but ground though it may be, I'm losing a ship and a half a day. If this line isn't moving in 5 days, we'll find someone who can move it. British steel versus American wood. The U.S. Navy wasn't fighting alone. To the north, a British carrier task force, the British Pacific Fleet, was also engaged off Okinawa. Its ships faced the same kamikaze threat, but fared better, thanks to one crucial design difference: steel flight decks. American carriers, built for speed and aircraft capacity, used lighter wooden decks. Kamikazes often punched straight through them, causing catastrophic fires. The British ships' armored decks, though, heavier, absorbed hits with less damage. Historian Samuel Eliot Morison described the difference vividly. A kamikaze hitting a steel flight deck crumpled up like a scrambled egg and did comparatively little damage. An American officer observing aboard a British carrier put it more bluntly: when a kamikaze hits a U.S. carrier, it's 6 months repair at Pearl. In a Limey carrier, it's a case of sweepers, man your brooms. May 11, 1945, the Bunker Hill Inferno. That contrast was seared into memory on May 11, 1945, when tragedy struck the fleet's pride, the USS Bunker Hill, CV-17. The Bunker Hill had just been resupplied, her decks stacked with aircraft, her tanks filled with over 2 million gallons of aviation fuel. Her crew, weary but confident, went about their duties under a clear morning sky. Then, just before 10 a.m., 2 kamikazes found her. The first slammed into the flight deck aft, smashing through parked aircraft and exploding with terrifying force. Seconds later, the second plane hit almost the same spot. Both carried full bomb loads. The resulting inferno engulfed the carrier from bow to stern. Seaman Second Class William Rowe, a 22-year-old from Michigan, later recalled, "We were living 24 hours a day on a floating target. You never knew if you'd be alive tomorrow. Then the plane came in. I saw tracers hitting it, but it just kept coming. It passed right over me and disappeared into the deck in a fireball. Fire spread so quickly that some crewmen never had time to move. Pilots trapped in the ready rooms suffocated as flames devoured the passageways. Aircraft loaded with bombs and fuel ignited in chain reactions that blew holes through the deck. Captain George Seitz, the ship's commander, fought desperately to save his vessel. He swung the Bunker Hill broadside to the wind to blow the flames away from a superstructure, then ordered a sharp 70-degree turn to spill fuel overboard. It was a brilliant maneuver, but the fire was already out of control. Hundreds of men abandoned ship or were blown overboard. Rowe jumped from a flight deck, an 80-foot plunge into burning water. He swam for 2 hours before a rescue craft pulled him out. When he returned the next day, the scene was unrecognizable. The ship looked like a skeleton. They'd lined 73 bodies along the deck, wrapped in canvas, ready for burial at sea. The Bunker Hill somehow limped to Ulithi under her own power, but she was finished for the war. A British carrier, with its steel deck, might have been back in action within days. The breaking point. By late May, the fleet was reaching the limits of endurance. The destroyers were battered, the carriers wounded, and the men hollow-eyed. Every day, more kamikazes came, and fewer Japanese pilots returned. Vice Admiral William F. Halsey and his Fifth Fleet soon relieved Spruance, marking a symbolic shift in the campaign. The worst of the Kikusui raids had passed, but the scars they left were indelible. Even as the Navy bled at sea, the soldiers and Marines were still clawing their way across Okinawa's southern ridges. Both battles, land and sea, were converging toward the same dreadful conclusion. The cost of Okinawa would soon make every American commander question what an invasion of Japan might mean, and what it might cost: endgame and reckoning, the price of Okinawa, and the lessons of fire. By June 1945, Okinawa was a wasteland, a once green island turned into a blasted landscape of craters, corpses, and smoldering villages. After nearly 3 months of continuous combat, the battle that had begun with thunderous confidence ended in a slow, exhausted silence. The Battle of Okinawa was over, but its legacy of courage, horror, and hard truths was only beginning to sink in. The final push. On land, the Japanese defense finally broke. Lieutenant General Mitsuru Ushijima, commander of the 32nd Army, saw the inevitable. His carefully constructed defensive lines had been pounded to dust by naval guns, bombs, and relentless infantry assaults. His men were starving, their ammunition spent, their positions surrounded. On June 21, 1945, Ushijima and his fiery chief of staff, General Isamu Cho, performed ritual suicide, seppuku, in their cave command post near Mabuni. Their aides burned their flags and papers before following them in death. The next day, June 22nd, U.S. forces declared Okinawa secured. It had taken 82 days. The cost was beyond comprehension. The toll in blood and steel. When the smoke cleared, the statistics told a story almost too vast to absorb. 130,000 Japanese soldiers killed, almost to the last man. 75,000 Okinawan civilians dead, many caught in crossfire, others coerced or terrified into suicide. 39,000 American ground troops killed or wounded. At sea, 34 ships sunk, 763 aircraft destroyed, and over 10,000 sailors killed or wounded, more than in any other Pacific naval campaign. Between April 1st and June 22nd, more than 1,465 kamikaze pilots had launched themselves at the American fleet. They sank destroyers, carriers, transports, hospital ships, anything they could reach. And though their attacks could not alter the outcome, they burned themselves into the memory of every survivor. To sailors who had lived through the firestorms off Okinawa, no statistics could capture the experience. One wrote simply, "The sea was always burning. Every sunset looked like another ship on fire." The lessons of terror. For the American High Command, Okinawa was not just a victory, it was a revelation. If Japan fought this ferociously for a single island, what would it do when the Allies invaded the home islands themselves? The Joint Chiefs of Staff calculated the projected casualties for Operation Downfall, the planned invasion of Japan. Up to 250,000 Allied dead, and possibly 1 million wounded or missing. Civilian casualties in Japan itself, millions. Admiral Nimitz summarized the Navy's fears in one blunt statement. "We are losing a ship and a half a day. If this is Okinawa, what will Honshu be?" That question reached the desk of President Harry S. Truman, who had taken office only weeks earlier after Roosevelt's death. The answer, in the minds of his military advisors, would soon point toward a weapon unlike any seen before. The kamikaze's legacy. The kamikaze had failed strategically, but psychologically it had succeeded beyond expectation. American sailors came away from Okinawa changed men. Their view of the enemy darkened by the sight of pilots deliberately killing themselves. Captain Charles R. Brown wrote of the paradox that haunted him. "It is a strange mixture of respect and pity, respect for any person who offers the supreme sacrifice for the things he stands for, and pity for the utter futility of such a sacrifice." For Japan, the kamikaze was both the ultimate expression of devotion and the symbol of despair, a weapon born from a nation cornered and unable to admit defeat. Voices from the wreckage. Survivors carried the memory of Okinawa with them long after the war ended. Jack Gebhardt, who had watched the Pringle go down, never forgot the faces of the men he couldn't save. You live through something like that, and it never leaves you. You hear an engine backfire, you see a flash in the sky, and for a second you're back there again, watching the ship go under. Seaman William Rowe, who leapt from the Bunker Hill into the flaming sea, later said, "I joined the Navy to see the world. At Okinawa, I saw hell instead." These men spoke for thousands whose stories went untold. Churchill's salute. The significance of Okinawa reached even across the Atlantic. On June 22, 1945, the same day the island was declared secure, Winston Churchill wrote to President Harry Truman, "The strength of willpower, devotion, and technical resources applied by the United States to this task, joined with the death struggle of the enemy, places this battle among the most intense and famous of military history. We make our salute to all your troops and their commanders engaged." It was a rare gesture of reverence from one hardened wartime leader to another, and to the men who had endured the crucible of Okinawa. The aftermath. The victory at Okinawa gave the Allies what they had sought, a forward base for bombing Japan and staging an invasion. But it also gave them a glimpse of the unimaginable cost that such an invasion would entail. Barely 6 weeks later, in August 1945, the United States would unleash the atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, weapons meant, in part, to prevent a repeat of Okinawa on an even greater scale. The war would end, but the shadow of the kamikaze, and of the men who faced them, would linger for generations. Epilogue: The Last Battle. Okinawa was the last great battle of World War II, and in many ways the most tragic. It was a victory built not only on strength, but on endurance, the endurance of sailors who manned their guns under fire, of soldiers who fought yard by yard through caves, of medics who worked until they collapsed, and of a nation that, even in triumph, began to grasp the true weight of war. In the decades that followed, historians would call Okinawa the typhoon of steel. But to the men who were there, it was simpler than that. It was the place where the world ended and began again, where courage met despair, and the sea burned with the memory of both.